Welcome to the EAU podcast series, AI in Urology, From Principles to Practice. In this episode, AI Policy in Urology, Sarah Collen and Dr. Karl Kowalewski discuss why policy, regulations, and governance are essential for the safe and effective use of artificial intelligence in healthcare. Together, they explore the importance of ethical frameworks, regulatory challenges, and how policy decisions shape the development and implementation of AI in urology. Join us as we embark on this informative journey.
Hello, everybody. My name is Karl Kowalewski, and I'm the chair of the AI working group of the EAU. And I'd like to welcome all of you for a new episode of our podcast series, AI in Urology, From Principles to Practice. Today's topic is policy AI. And to be honest, this is an area for many of us urologists where we are not very familiar with. So I'm more than happy that Sarah Collen is here with me today. Sarah is a policy expert and has been working as a policy manager at the EAU for the past couple of years. Sarah, great to have you here.
Hi, thanks for your welcome, Karl. And as you said, I'm Sarah and I work for the EAU Policy Office. I have been working in Brussels for the past 25 years on different EU policies and legislation. And since 2012, I've been really focused on healthcare sector laws and policies. And I've been with the EAU since 2020.
That's great to hear. So, Sarah, when urologists hear the word policy, this often sounds quite abstract. Can you explain in very simple terms what does policy actually mean in healthcare and why should clinicians care about policy?
It's a great question. Thanks for asking it. So at the EAU Policy Office, what we're trying to do really is to interpret the priorities from the ground in urological practice and care, the concerns from our EAU members and different scientific advancements. And we're trying to make sure that we communicate those messages to EU policymakers. In terms of being a bridge between EAU members with EU, so European Union policymakers and regulators, what we do always is work in coalition. So with patients, with urologists, with clinical researchers, and make sure that we communicate the most up-to-date scientific knowledge in a way that's accessible to, a lay language to policy and decision makers. Often that is communicating the social, the health, economic impact of certain policies or regulations, what it means to people, urologists, urological patients on the ground.
Okay, I understand. And also, of course, as for everything, there are quite a lot of different policies. There are policies, of course, from the EU, but there are also more policies coming up from societies, from scientific societies, for example, AUA, ESMO, but even EAU. So when you sit together with your team, who is involved? As you said, you're patients, you're scientists, but how, as a clinician, could I contribute to this if I wanted to?
Another great question. So from an EAU perspective, the EAU Policy Office is very much focused on advocating with policymakers at European Union level on priorities that we collectively believe are important for urological care and practice and for better patient outcomes. And you can do that as members of the EAU by getting in touch with the EAU Policy Office, and we will very happily help plug you into the right stream or priority that you might want to focus on. So we work on issues related to maybe oncology, GU cancers, but also functional urology as well. But in this podcast, I think we're talking on one of the more technical issues that we work on, which is regulation and laws, EU regulation that sets standards for medical devices and also for artificial intelligence.
So thank you, Sarah. It really explained a lot, and we will also dive deeper into the question of regulation later on the interview. But just for now, as it's still quite abstract, at least for me, can you give maybe one or two very concrete examples how policy regulations, maybe even in AI, would affect me as a clinician, but also as a scientist in daily work?
I guess it's probably good to start thinking about, so urologists operate in a health system, and your health system is usually regulated at national level by your Ministry of Health, but also by other ministries like ministries of finance, play a critical role in making decisions about how the health system is structured, workforce capacity, resources that are invested into the health system. At an EU level, so the level where the EAU policy office focuses in on, we deal with specifically the kind of technologies and devices and services and products that are regulated as part of the EU's internal market. So the EU is an internal single market and it likes to set standards for the products and services that are available. And it does that to enable what it says, what it calls the free flow of these products and services. So it means that products and services that are developed in one country, maybe Germany or France or even Poland, can then be used and brought and sold in other European countries as part of the internal market. Where that's really important in terms of AI and AI in urological care is that AI and AI-enabled medical devices are regulated at European level. Probably there are several pieces of legislation that have an impact, but the two most important ones are the medical devices regulation, and also there's an accompanying IVD, in vitro diagnostics regulation, and an AI Act. So we have those two pieces of legislation have an impact on the products and services that you use in urological care. So whether that's an MRI that takes a prostate reading, or a robot that you use for surgery, or any surgical or medical tool that you use, even the most basic ones will be at some level regulated by either the medical devices regulation and the AI Act as well, if it has some kind of AI enablement.
Perfect. I'm happy that you brought those two things up, the MDR and the AI Act. But just before we dive deeper into this, one more question. Because there are member states, member countries of the EAU, which are not part of the EU. Is this something which is challenging for you, or how do you deal with that?
So we work principally with the European Union, and so with that regulation. It is true that there isn't a regulator, an internal market beyond the EAU 27, although many of the neighbouring countries will apply similar rules. We focus on the EU because it is probably the strongest regional organisation that has direct applicability on products that are available in our region. Although we recognise that if you're not one of the EU 27 member states, it's probably not directly applicable. However, a lot of the standards that come up are then discussed maybe within, for example, the WHO Europe region, which is a much broader region of countries. And there tends to be quite a trickle and a ripple effect of what's decided at EU level and how that impacts the region and even the world more beyond the EU 27 borders. But I have to say, we're quite a small team. We have 2.5 staff and a small board group. Professor Van Poppel and Professor Van Kerrebroek are our chair and vice chair. So we're a small team. So we have to also focus on where we can have the most impact, given the fact that we're also a relatively young and small team.
Let's move back to the EU AI Act. Can you explain for us as urologists what is this in plain language?
Yes, so the AI Act is what the EU would call a horizontal piece of legislation. So it's a very complicated term to say it's actually a multi-sectoral piece of legislation. So it doesn't unlike the medical devices regulation, which is very health sector specific, the AI Act applies to all sectors. So it is the EU's way of defining what they think are the key issues and the key standards and the key concerns that must be addressed for AI, whether they're used in health or in, I don't know, climate science or in energy or in other public administrations. It's a multi-sectorial piece of legislation. And what it has done is taken a risk-based approach. It tries to define what it means by risk in the use of AI. And then it says there are some uses of AI that are going to be low risk and low risk to the rights of European citizens or to any kind of safety concerns. But there are some other AI applications that could be moderate to high risk. For medical devices, so in our sector, what the AI did was say that any medical device that would be classified of a sufficient risk, so anything from basically moderate to high risk in terms of medical device, that would have to go through an approval process through a notified body, so through a regulatory body. If you have a medical device that is using an element of AI, or if it is just a piece of AI software that would be classed as a moderate to high risk device that would need a conformity assessment, a regulator's opinion on the safety and effectiveness of that product, then it also is classified as a high risk AI device or piece of software. And that means that the AI Act applies, and all the provision of the AI Act around conformity assessment for AI also needs to apply. So if you're applying currently, if you are wanting to use AI-enabled medical devices, you look at the sector-specific medical device regulation, and then if you need to go to a regulator for their opinion, you also have to fully apply the AI Act conformity assessment as well to two different regulators and two different files that need to be submitted. And what many have said, and I think it is true, is there was concern about basically over-regulation. If you're submitting your full dossier and your full file under medical devices, which is quite a robust piece of legislation anyway, around patient safety, conformity assessment, quality management systems, are you not already putting in place much of what should be expected under AI? Where is there duplication, overlap, and how do we make sure that we avoid unnecessary bureaucracy?
Well, so this sounds quite complicated for me, but let's just assume for a second, to be really practical for our listeners, let's assume I'm in the development of a new technology, which is helped with AI, and I want to get started with all of this. Where should I start? How can I read into it? Who can I contact maybe?
So I think if you are interested or if you are working on AI within your own hospital, you are probably, or you may be starting from a clinical research perspective, and it's probably quite important to say that clinical research is outside of scope. So both the medical devices and the AI Act, the focus is really on when you want to place those devices on the market. So when you want to make them available for sale. So the clinical research is obviously regulated, but the provisions within both medical devices and AI Act allow for clinical research. If you're starting with clinical research, you probably have, if you're following the scientific and ethical principles of your own institution, you probably have a good basis to go forward.
Sarah, I remember when we met at the EAU in London 2 weeks ago, and also you told me there are quite some changes going on in this policy environment. Is there anything we should know right now already? What kind of changes are going on there? What will be important for us? Or is it just not clear at the current stage?
I think there's some really important changes going on. And I think these changes are taking place quite quickly. So both the medical devices regulation and IVD regulation, and also the AI Act, and and also aligned policies like data protection are all being revised as part of the European Commission's simplification initiative. Now, that means that they've taken on board the views of stakeholders that have said there's too much unnecessary EU regulation in this space, and they're trying to think through how they can make it easier for particularly European businesses to make their way through these different regulatory requirements. What I can say from the Commission proposals, so the Commission proposals are all public. What the Commission is wanting to do is to make sure that for AI-enabled medical devices, it will in fact be the medical devices regulation that is the regulation and the only conformity channel, the only regulatory channel that a company or would need to go through. So only one approval process. The AI Act will still stand, but there's sort of downscaling how the AI Act is applied to medical devices, meaning that the AI Act will still be relevant and the provisions of the AI Act will still apply, but they will have to be transferred into sector-specific guidelines and interpretive legislation. They call them implementing acts and delegated acts. So what will happen is if the Commission gets its way, there will just be the medical devices regulation approval process, and all the relevant bits of AI Act will be part of that medical devices conformity assessment. All the guidelines on the standards that would need to be lived up to would then fall under a very sector-specific medical devices framework, which I think probably makes a lot of sense. However, a lot of that guidance doesn't exist at the moment, and a lot of notified bodies, so the regulators that regulate medical devices, I think there's a lot of capacity issues there. So my one concern would be that there is a little bit of a vacuum in terms of that sector-specific guidance, and that would need to begin at pace to make sure that there are some, I think it is right that there are some parts of the AI Act that are very pertinent, making sure that AI-enabled devices are safe in medical care. Things like detection of bias, quality data. These are all really important issues that need to be probably added to the conformity assessment for medical devices. I think it's probably a good move in the right direction to combine those two conformity assessments into one, so that things are a little bit clearer.
Okay. I can already see policy is almost a sign of its own. But moving on to the last part of our interview, you already mentioned this a little bit. It's important for business, which is coming from Europe, to get to the market quite quickly, and especially as compared to the Northern American system. Do you feel that the European system is more restrictive, and do you feel this is as a challenge for us or the risk for us that we fall behind in terms of development and implementing new technologies faster into clinical care?
I'm not an expert on US regulation, but what I believe from experience of watching sort of both markets is that the US it tends to let innovation run a little bit before it sets the laws, whereas Europe tends to think about the innovation first and set the standards. And I guess there are pluses and advantages of both systems. The US, as far as I know, doesn't have an equivalent of the AI Act. So it doesn't have a multi-sectorial AI legislation. And I think the FDA, so their regulator, would look at any kind of AI-enabled technology through their own medical devices regulations. And I think that probably has an advantage. They also have some schemes that allow for faster access. They have this ability to fast track some of what they would categorize as lower risk devices. However, I think behind the scenes, a lot of the standards are set by whether it's ISO standards or other international standards for quality management and safety. So there's a lot of actual international engagement around this. I believe that Europe can use its own risk-based approach to define what is right in terms of patient safety and what is acceptable and not on the European market for its own.
So, Sarah, thank you very much for all your insights. And we are already at the end of our podcast. But let me ask you two more final questions. First question would be, as a clinician, how can I stay informed in this changing landscape? That would be the first question. The second question, if there's one thing that every urologist should remember about AI policy, what would it be from your perspective?
So if you want to stay informed about changes in regulation at EU level, EAU Policy Office is your strategic partner there. And we're working very much with the EAU AI working group as well. So we warmly welcome any inquiries to our office. And I guess at the moment, my key message to any clinician involved in AI-enabled medical devices is watch this space. The European regulatory environment is changing, and we hope for the better.
Perfect. Sarah, thank you very much again. I really learned a lot, and I also learned that I don't know much about policy. So I think it's still a very, very important topic, despite it does not get as much attention as it maybe should be. But thank you very much for taking the time today, and hope to see you soon again. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for this insightful episode. We are sure our listeners enjoyed it. To keep up with the latest EAU podcasts and stay informed on the urological advancements, be sure to subscribe to our EAU podcast channel on your favourite podcast app. Until next time, keep learning and stay inspired.